This is the first talk of today, just to make sure everyone kind of has the same base knowledge of serverless information to get the most out of the later sections that we'll have today, the later talks. And to start talking about how we change our mindset. When we move from on-premise to the cloud, you kind of have to change the way you think about how you build applications. When you move from just the cloud in general, which could be on EC2 or like the GCP or Azure equivalents of these managed VMs in the cloud, you also have to have a shift in mindset to fully leverage this new paradigm of serverless. So I stole the ideas of Mr. Clausewitz. What can he teach us about serverless? The key point of that is that he talks about 3 levels of the way that warfare is conducted. So you have the tactical, which is what happens on the ground. It's very much concerned with specifics of how you do specific things. If your opponent does this is what you do, and it's very prescriptive. This is what steps are laid out for what you're supposed to do. Then we move up from there as an operational level, where teams or organizations will be given just kind of a broad mandate. You're in charge of ops, you're in charge of development, you're in charge of observability, and then it's kind of on the people inside that organization to decide, how they actually implement that, how they implement the tactics associated with that. And then above that is strategic. So you hear about some of these, strategies or doctrines, what organizations call the famous ones are the Rumsfeld doctrine or shock and awe is another type of doctrine, a strategy, a way of, as a very broad level with a broad brush, how do we do something? How do you win a war? How do you manage serverless? Both of them can cause a lot of pain, so that's why I thought it was an appropriate analogy. So real quick, this is me. It's me and my dog Halo. The pictures, she's a black lab. It's incredibly hard to photograph a black dog. I've seen a lot of white dogs when I've been here, and I thought it felt counterintuitive because I figured with all the snow you have in Nordic countries, you'd lose a white dog a lot easier. But no, they're still very popular. So it's my Twitter handle. If you ever want to say any mean things to me, you can just shoot me a DM. I might not reply, but you can just vent that anger if I upset anyone today. I currently work as a developer advocate for builder tools and developer tools inside of AWS. Although everything I say here today, I'm not speaking on behalf of AWS. I submitted this talk before I started working for AWS, so the content's the same. I just have to make it very clear that I'm speaking for myself as an individual person, not speaking for AWS today. So I'm allowed to say that I don't like James's coat because I'm speaking for myself. Previously, I worked at iRobot, the makers of the Roomba vacuum cleaner. I was at MIT for a while, and I was in the U.S. Marines for a little while, which is where I got the idea for the Clausewitz analogy. And I was at Amazon before, a couple years ago, working on Alexa and Amazon Robotics, so I've since come back. But you didn't come here to talk to me, to learn about me, you came to learn about serverless. So what is serverless, right? At a very tactical level, when we talk about this is the individual contributors and usually called line managers or people who manage individual contributors, your first level of management. The way service helps people in this kind of a role, serverless helps people in this kind of a role, is that the things that they're focused on are usually cloud provider specific things, right? People who are worried about the tactical details of serverless are worried about how long can my Lambda function execute before it times out, or how long can my Azure function execute before it times out, or what programming languages are supported. Some might support PHP, some might support COBOL, hopefully not. But these are very specific implementation details. It's very concrete about here are the shortfalls. People are asking for a very specific thing, and you're giving them a very specific response to those things. For me, I'll have more content in here just because this is what I'm familiar with, because I'm not very smart, so I think about the things I can physically touch. There are people who are much smarter than me that will talk about strategy and operations in much more detail, but we'll just kind of briefly cover those today. And when we talk about how tactically how serverless helps us as individual contributors, I'm allowed to grow as an individual contributor by contributing either engineering knowledge or domain knowledge to an engineering application, right? If I own let's say I'm on a team that creates a billing service, right, to charge our customers some money, I could provide value if I know all of the specifics for like a Unix operating system to get the software to run correctly on there. But it's kind of a distraction from what like the actual team is supposed to be doing, right? Like it would be better if I were contributing by knowing, how do we process transactions on a blockchain, or how do we split up transactions across, multiple payment providers. Those are domain-specific information, domain-specific knowledge that a way for me to create value for my organization. Both of those are very valuable, but with serverless, you don't have to focus anything on the first one that I mentioned, this what's called undifferentiated heavy lifting, which is, my mouth is very dry. I should drink more water. Sorry, lost my shot. So, no, you're okay. You want to do that? Okay. He's going. Okay, now that he's gone. So by being able to focus on this, sorry, I didn't skip. By being able to focus on just like the core skills that create like domain-specific knowledge for me, that I'm more valuable to the company because like almost everything I know is about the role that I'm filling in the company, and I don't have to spend time keeping up with, updates to like kernel patches that come out, or oh, thank you so much. It's like I ate sand before I came over here.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be watching us.
Oh yeah, right. What is the cloud? Right. And then I'm also able to lean on the cloud providers for the things that they're better at, right? Like like I said before, I'm not super smart, so I probably wouldn't create the best queue that ever exists, but a managed service provider, whoever that is, the one that they create will probably be much better than any one that I could create, right? I could just treat it like a thing that I put transactions into and they come out the other side in some kind of an order. And because they have teams that are focused on just providing this service, they can provide a much higher level of like detail and availability and correctness that I could provide or my team could provide. And that's not to say that we're not competent or qualified. It's just that they do this professionally. It's this specialization of labor that they're focused on just that. And then they in turn make money on doing this at such a large scale that they're able to do it much more economically than individual organizations could do it. So then like everybody wins in this situation. So I get, by leaning on their implementation of either a queue or a message passing system or some kind of compute layer, my application gets much higher availability, which means that I'm spending less time. So, first person quit. I knew it. I'm spending less time, on call, responding to, the service going down, bugs in the software, things like that aren't related to like core business logic. The downside of that is that if there is a problem, it's almost always related to your core business logic, which your provider generally can't help you with. So you have to make sure that you understand, like the billing example, specifically how you're supposed to bill your customers. Because if you make a mistake and you don't bill any of your customers for a month and then you run out of money, that's not something that your cloud provider can help you with. You'd probably have the same situation if you weren't in a cloud provider, but you also have a bunch of other fires you have to put out at the same time too. And then this also allows us to do what I call like micro experiments, which is where I can spin up like a new stack using some kind of infrastructure as code tool or just poking around in the console. I can get access to as much compute as I need, connect that together with like a queuing system or notification system, some kind of API mechanism, and play with a few different architectures while I'm still learning. And I'm not one of these more senior engineers who can just sit down and design an entire system from scratch. That I can do these small experiments, and because almost all of the cloud providers charge you specifically just for what you use, like pay-as-you-go pricing. As far as I know, most of them only use this pricing model, that you can only pay for what you use. So you do a small experiment, you might pay $1 or $2 for this experiment. Whereas without serverless or without the cloud, you would have to purchase some hardware, which is already at the cheapest, like $30 for a Raspberry Pi. All the peripherals that come with it, which is like another $50. So you're already $80 in, you haven't even done anything yet. So by having this like managed service, managed hardware, that you're able to do a lot of these very small experiments and try more hypotheses and then see what works. There are some people, like I said, who could just sit down and like design this stuff without having to like build it a couple of times first. But those people are very rare and they're also very expensive to hire. So that's why it's generally better for the rest of us who focus on this tactical level to why this is such a good thing for us. Switch. Which brings us to our operational level. So as I described before, this is for your directors or senior managers. Some places call them middle managers, which has kind of a negative connotation, so I don't like using that term. But these are people who manage other managers. So they're responsible for maybe like the direction of one of the groups, or like they might be responsible for a product line or some small slice of the organization. And I think this is a picture I just found online. It was Creative Commons, so it's no copyright issues with it. It's from the U.S. Department of Defense. And this is where you just assign, like, okay, this area is for you. Do whatever you need to do, but make sure that's secure, or find the WMDs, I think is what they were looking for in there. None of them did. Right? But you see, like, there's nothing in here saying, like, okay, this specific unit has to do this thing. It just says you're responsible for this area. So as you move up in an organization, you'll see that you have directors or senior managers who are tasked with tasks like this. Like, you're responsible for this product. They may not have had much input into why they're working on that product, or how it fits into the broader strategy of the organization. But within that product, they have a very wide degree of latitude to implement features, incorporate feedback from customers, kind of like shift the direction inside that product. But they're still kind of bound by like these lines, which are also kind of like what the product does and how it fits into the portfolio of the company. Next we have, so what serverless allows for these like middle managers, what I call like operational independence. That you've got a couple of cases. So one case is that the ops team is separate from this of a mythical director. We'll say, hey, towards the director of this organization, and he may have an ops team like inside of his organization, or it may be in like an ops org where his peer as another director manages the ops team. So if they want to deploy some software in like a traditional sense, it's not serverless. You have to get it all ready for production, do a bunch of testing. You have to convince this other organization, okay, this is ready to be rolled out into production. Make some room in your schedule to deploy this. There's some horse trading that goes on, and then finally it gets deployed. That slows down Heitor's organization from being able to like deliver features, because you stop working on the engineering part of it and start working on negotiating with this other org to deliver that. The alternative is that the ops team could be inside of Heitor's organization. That's a very common approach for companies that practice like DevOps with a microservice architecture. Nope, not quite there yet. So even if it is inside Heitor's org, so I can just say, we're assuming he's my boss, and okay, here's the software is ready, and he can just take it to some team and say, okay, now you have to deploy this. Because I'm the boss, you don't get to negotiate, we just move straight. So now we're like high velocity, we're moving very quickly. But these are people who are just doing like ops work, and that ops work is not necessarily like in line with your core business, right? This is people who are keeping the servers up and running. Even if they are like cloud VMs, you need to apply patches. There was like the Heartbleed and WannaCry and some other like types of malware that came out that you have to apply patches to those and manage moving applications off those servers, updating them, moving them back. That requires some excess capacity to have the room to kind of shuffle things around in here to apply these updates. And the people who have those skills generally aren't the same people who have like the core business skills we talked about in the tactical section. So now you have to hire like teams of people with skills that are not quite aligned with your core business for like the needs for your core business. But you still have to have them. You have to pay them. There's HR associated, human resources associated with this, and it creates a lot of overhead for the organization. Now it's much less overhead than it was 10 or 15 years ago, but it's still overhead we don't necessarily need. I'm not saying go out and fire your whole ops team. I'm just saying that like there's better uses for them, because generally like people who do ops, like they could easily do software engineering as well. They could be working on adding features more quickly, so it makes your organization much more quickly by leveraging some of these like serverless architectural patterns to deliver features more quickly without dedicated ops support. Which brings us to our next point, is like hiring qualifications. So when a person graduates from university, or they finish some kind of a coding boot camp, their skill level will say is like this much, right? It's like this much. But in order to be like a productive member of the team, it probably needs to be like this much plus like a little bit more, right? And this is things that they don't teach in the schools or the boot camps. This is things that are specific to your organization, how you manage committing code into a repository, or how you manage deploying the code. These are things that are just everyone who starts has to learn these new things that they wouldn't learn externally. They might have skills that are similar from another org that would make them learn them more quickly. But with serverless, it like shrinks that gap of what they know and what they need to know, because the things that they don't teach in school, but they might need to know would be like patching an operating system, right? These things are, installing an operating system, or if you're still on-prem, like racking and stacking the hardware, like actually installing this hardware in a data center, like you don't necessarily need those skills for your business to do its job. So what serverless allows you to do is like shrink those qualifications. The things you really need in an employee for them to be productive is much smaller, so that you can have a much broader pool of people to select from, which gives you like a more diverse employee pool to choose from, which causes you to have a more diverse employee profile, which gives you better applications. This has been like widely studied. It's basically settled. If you have a diverse group, will come up with better ideas than like a strictly homogeneous group. Right? And serverless helps us get this by lowering the requirements that's needed to be a productive member of the team. Because the stuff that's not core to your business, you don't necessarily need someone with those skills. And then as part of this, similar to what I had mentioned previously for Tactically, where it allows like micro experiments, that same effect you see at a much larger level, where if someone wants to try like a whole new architecture for the application, without serverless, without the cloud, you'd have to go and buy $500,000 worth of hardware. You'd have to find some power for the lease, or a lease for the power, cooling, all these other things that you'd have to do, which would require a director or a senior manager to sign off on this to justify this very large expense. But because with serverless and pay-as-you-go pricing, you could spin up all the capacity you wanted, do this, try this new architecture and see if it worked or not. And if it didn't work, you could just roll it back and you only pay for that little bit that you used. So because there's much less of like what's called a CapEx, capital expense, and more of an operational expense, it pushes that decision making down to the individual contributors and the managers who like have their fingers on the pulse of technology. They know what the new, cool computing paradigms like serverless are, like things that they want to try, and it allows them to make those decisions at a more local level, and it frees up cycles for the directors and senior managers to focus on the product. So they can say, inside the product, this is where I'd like to take it. I want to add these new features, or I want to make it this much faster or this much cheaper, and they're not spending time thinking about justifying large CapEx or OpEx costs for experimentation. Because of that, you get less risk, right? If I give everyone in here the option, I have some coin in my pocket. It might be biased, it might not be. And if you pay me $1 million, we'll flip the coin. And if you guess the correct orientation when it lands, I'll give you $50 million. And if you fail, I keep your $1 million, you pay me another 10, right? Like some people might take that, right? They're not very risk averse, like they would do that. But if I had said, I have a whole bag of coins over here, and each of them is kind of biased, maybe in a slightly different way. And each coin to flip it only costs you $1. And if you are wrong, you lose that $1. And if you're right, you win $5. And also, in addition to the $5, you can, you get some kind of a new feature. You could predict how biased the next coin would be. You could add new features to your product. You could do all these other things. But I told you, you have to do one of these options that I give you. How many people in here, by show of hands, would you pick the first one?
Can I do it multiple times?
Yeah, for the second one, you can do it until we run out of coins in the bag. The first one, you can't. You only get one. One a quarter, one a year. Which is like this old traditional waterfall style of deployment. You bundle up all of these changes, and you invest a lot of engineering effort and time and money into creating the software, and then you try to deploy it in one big bang. And most of the time, sometimes it works, and then everyone says you have a great product. But sometimes there's a lot of bugs in it. It has to be rolled back. You get some bad press. It costs you time and money to fix, and it slows down your velocity. But if you could release those features much more quickly and smaller features, you can learn from the mistakes that you made for each one of those smaller ones at a much smaller scale. Sorry. So was there anyone who wanted the first bet? I got a bridge I'd like to sell you. Which brings us to our final point, which is strategy. Right? And this I don't have as much content about because I'm not one of these big thinker kind of broad brush strokes people. This is what CEOs, CIOs, CTOs. I generally leave the VP of SVP of engineering or CTO out of discussions about this because they fill a very unique, specific technical role. So when I say the C-suite doesn't have to worry about technology investment issues, the CTO definitely would, but the CEO and the others, CFO might not as much. Right? Right. So the same benefits that we saw at the tactical and strategic level, or the operational level, we can also see at the strategic level, where by not having to worry about the data centers that your business owns, that you can focus on, are we going to grow? Are we going to grow our business into this segment? Are we going to release this new product? Are we going to devote like the resources we have to acquiring some startup that'll help us be more competitive in the space? Or are we going to like double down on our own efforts? Right? If you have to, at a strategic level, we'll say James is the CEO in this example. If he has to decide, okay, we have one data center in the US, but we want to expand into Europe, then we have to buy a data center in Europe, and maybe our supplier doesn't make power supplies that are compatible with Europe, so they have to get those weird adapters, and Europe has like 10 different types of power adapters. And it becomes like this whole thing, like 6 months later, there's just a string of adapters just to power a data center. But with serverless, because it's like a managed service provider, and hopefully any managed service provider people are using have data centers in more than one country or continent, that you can just, you'll know that the services will behave the same way there, so you don't have to worry about this. Like the hardware that works in the US will still work in Europe, it'll still work in Asia, it'll still work in Antarctica if that's where someone has a data center and you want to work. Right? And by not having to think about these things, then you're able to focus on your like core business, right? Like you can free up those brain cycles or time on the golf course to thinking about where you're going to grow your business, and less about like the specifics of how you would do that in terms of purchasing resources. And again, hopefully this has become like a pattern. A lot of these benefits at each level kind of like bubble their way up to the top. So we get this like smaller decisions. So when someone wanted to like refactor the app, they could do that, at like the director level or smaller. Things that used to require maybe like the entire C-suite, like the chief financial officer would have to sign off on something because it's half the operating budget for the year, is now much cheaper because you don't have to fully commit to a 10-year or a 5-year or 20-year lease on a lot of these things, so that they can be handled at like a much lower level in the organization with someone who has more direct experience in that area and can make better decisions, because they're making, like I said, smaller decisions. That the cost of being wrong is much smaller, even though the cost of winning is also like much smaller. But you can learn from each improvement that you make or each decision that you make to ideally incrementally get better. Oh, wait. Did I not? Sorry. And that is it. I thought I had more content on this one, but like I said, it was small. And that's all I have. Thank you.